One drizzly Sunday morning, Edward was waiting outside the vicarage for his friend, Trevor. Trevor was usually happy to see Edward, but this morning there was a sad frown on his face as he trundled towards the railway line. "Hello, Trevor," Edward said. "Hello," Trevor replied glumly. "What's wrong?" "Emma wasn't here today." "Who's Emma?" "Emma Chesterton, one of the vicar's congregation. She usually comes by to say hello to me after the service on Sunday morning. I've known her for 11 years, since she was 8. Edward couldn't help feeling a little bit sad for Trevor. "Maybe she's just feeling a little bit sick," Edward said, trying to cheer up the traction engine. "It's not that, Edward. She hasn't been seen since yesterday morning. Her parents have called the police to find her." Now Edward understood why Trevor was looking so worried. "I hope they find her," he said. "So do I." Before Edward could reply, the blast of a diesel horn sounded out in the distance. "That sounds like Bogo," Edward said. "The line ahead should be clear. I'm afraid I have to get going, Trevor." Edward whistled and moved off, but he couldn't help thinking about what Trevor had said. Surely, Edward thought, there was something that he could do to help. After all, if the police had been called in, then it must have been a pretty serious situation. What could he and the other engines do to help find the missing girl, he asked himself. A moment later he had an answer. "Yes," he said to himself, "that would work, and I'm sure the Fat Controller would agree." Edward soon reached the junction with the main line, and he came to a halt opposite the signal box. Three short toots brought the signalman over. "Yes, Edward? Can you please call Sir Topham Hatt and ask him to meet me at Wellsworth Station along with the policeman? It's about the missing girl, Emma Chesterton." The signalman agreed to pass on Edward's message. By the time he had reached the freight station at Wellsworth, Edward had explained his idea to his driver and fireman. "Well, there's Sir Topham Hatt," his driver said as they approached the platform. "Let's see what he's got to say." Sure enough, the Fat Controller was waiting on the platform along with a policeman. Both men watched Edward curiously as he drew up alongside the platform. "Edward," said the Fat Controller, "this is Constable Hastings." "Pleased to meet you, Edward. Now I believe you have some information about the missing girl, Emma Chesterton." "Not exactly, sir. It's just... we engines go all over Sodor. If we knew what she looked like, and with Sir Topham's permission, we could keep an eye out for her to help with the search effort." "That's a splendid idea, Edward," the Fat Controller said. "Yes," Hastings agreed. "I'll speak to Inspector Thompson and make the arrangements." Edward smiled. Hopefully they would be able to find something. The Fat Controller quickly put out an alert, and the word soon spread amongst the engines. For the rest of that afternoon and the following morning, the engines kept their eyes peeled for the missing teenage girl, or anything that would provide a clue to her location. At Crovan's Gate, Henry told Scarlow of the search, and he puffed off to tell the other engines. Duck informed Bert of the Arlesdale Railway, and at Kildane Station, Donald informed one of the electric engines who ran the Peel Godred branch. He then passed word on to the engines of the Culdee Fell Railway. All over the island, wherever the rails ran, the engines were looking out for a person in trouble. It was late on Monday afternoon when Thomas arrived at Elsbridge Station. Despite everyone's best efforts, there was still no word on Emma Chesterton. A policeman was standing on the platform as Thomas pulled in, speaking to some of the waiting passengers. "And she was driving a red car at the time of her disappearance," the policeman was saying. Something stirred in Thomas's memory. "Officer, I think I might know something," Thomas said. The policeman turned around. "It's Thomas, isn't it? What do you know?" "Well, it was late on Saturday morning. I was taking my usual 10 o'clock train from Knapford to Farquhar. I was going past Henry on the viaduct. As I approached the end of the viaduct, I saw a car sitting amongst the trees. It was a red car. I thought it was a bit strange at the time, but I didn't think anything of it. Can you show me where you saw the car? Of course, Thomas replied. Thomas left Annie and Clarabelle behind and took the policeman to where he had seen the car on Saturday. The policeman crossed over to the car and looked at it for a few minutes, making a couple of notes in his notebook. He then returned to where Thomas was waiting. That's definitely her car, Thomas. I'm going to have to organise a search party. The policeman glanced around. Although it's getting dark, I'm not sure if we'll be able to get anybody out here before tomorrow. Meanwhile, at Brenton Docks, Diesel had been shunting some China clay cars. He backed down on a siding next to where Edward was waiting with a passenger train. Edward, there's something I don't quite understand. What would that be? This missing girl you have us all looking for, Emma what's her name. Why does it matter to you if we find her? You haven't even met her. I mean, I know she needs to be found, but what do you get out of it? Edward thought for a moment, considering Diesel's question. Before he could reply, Bill puffed up with some trucks.
It's called caring about others, Diesel, he said cheekily. You should try it sometime.
Bill's got it right, Diesel, Edward said.
I have? I have, yes.
Diesel was about to reply when the Fat Controller strode out of the station and over to Edward.
Edward, I've just had a call from Inspector Thompson. Thanks to Thomas, they have found Emma Chesterton's car at the viaduct outside Knapford Station.
What's happening now, sir?
The police are organising a search, but they may not be able to get anyone out there before tomorrow, as the light's beginning to fade.
I see, said Edward, still looking a bit worried. Before he could say any more, it was time for him to leave. Diesel followed a few moments later with his China clay train. As Diesel headed along the main line, he couldn't help thinking about the conversation he had just had with Edward and Bill. It had been a couple of years since the Fat Controller had purchased him for the Northwest Railway, and yet he still wasn't really one of the engines. Maybe there was something in this caring about others thing, Diesel thought to himself. Perhaps he should give it a try. He was sick of being ostracized. As he approached the viaduct, Diesel made a decision. "Driver, I think we should slow down," he said. Diesel slowly crept out onto the viaduct, listening carefully. From what he had overheard the Fat Controller telling Edward, he knew that the missing girl must be somewhere nearby. "Driver, stop!" he called. He could hear the faint sound of sobbing drifting through the evening air. Once he had stopped in the middle of the viaduct, Diesel tooted his horn twice. "Hello? Is there anybody there?"
Yes, I'm down here.
Diesel's driver leant out of the cab and peered over the viaduct into the valley below.
She's down in the valley, Diesel. We're not going to be able to reach her.
I believe we passed a signal box about half a mile back. Our guard could go and sing for help. The train's guard quickly ran back to the signal box to raise the alarm, and an uncomfortable silence fell on the bridge. "How did you end up down there?" Diesel asked, mainly to break the silence.
You're that small black diesel engine, aren't you?
"Yes."
I like to come here and watch you and your friends go by when I've got a lot to think about. It helps me relax. That's why I came here on Saturday.
"To relax?"
Yes, I had an argument with my parents. I just needed to think.
Emma paused for a moment.
I tripped over and fell down here. I can't climb back up. I think I broke my arm.
Before she could say any more, a loud whirring noise filled the air. Diesel looked up just in time to see Harold the helicopter swoop down. "I hear you found the missing girl we've been looking for." "Yes, she's down in the valley." Harold looked over. "Ah yes, I see her. Jolly good show, old boy." Harold carefully flew down into the valley and landed next to where Emma was sitting. Harold's pilot helped her aboard. Then the helicopter took off and quickly headed for the hospital in Knapford. As Diesel headed off, he couldn't help grinning. It was the first time he had received a "well done" from anyone, and he was beginning to understand what Bill and Edward had meant as well. The next day, Thomas was taking a stone train through Tidmouth Station. As he approached the station, he saw the station master waving a red flag. He stopped just before the platform and looked around curiously. Edward was waiting on the up line with the passenger train, and the Fat Controller was standing on the platform with two people whom Thomas didn't know. "Edward, what's going on?" Thomas asked. "There's something Sir Topham Hatt wants to tell the three of us," Edward replied. "Three of us?" Thomas said. A moment later, Diesel sidled up next to Edward. "Did you want to see me, sir?" he asked. "That's correct, Diesel," the Fat Controller said. He gestured to the man and woman standing next to him. "I'm going to introduce Emma's parents, Ian and Barbara Chesterton. Barbara and I would just like to say thank you for what you three did for our daughter." "We're glad we could help," Thomas said. "Yes," Edward said. "How is Emma doing?"
She's coming home from hospital this afternoon.
replied Barbara.
After she gets her cast off, she'll be back to normal.
Diesel grinned again, and he shot a look over at Edward. "I understand what you meant yesterday, Edward. You and Bill were right." Edward smiled. "I'm glad to hear it," Edward replied. And with that, Diesel and Thomas headed off.